Prologue. The Summer of Madness. It began in the heat of a cruel summer. The year was 1518, a time when Europe was a patchwork of superstition, faith, and fear. The city of Strasbourg, nestled along the Rhine, shimmered beneath the July sun. Its narrow streets baked in the relentless heat. Bread was scarce. Disease stalked the alleys. The poor starved, and the devout whispered that God had turned his face away. No one could have known that within days those same streets would be filled not with merchants or mourners, but with dancers. Not the graceful, joyful kind. These were bodies jerking, trembling, convulsing, like puppets in invisible hands. Feet bleeding, eyes vacant, faces locked between ecstasy and agony. No music played, and yet the city danced. The first to move was a woman, her name lost to time. Some called her Frau Trophia, others simply the first dancer. She stepped into the street one morning and began to sway, her feet tapping to a rhythm no one else could hear. At first, people watched with pity, then curiosity, then fear, because she did not stop, not for hunger, not for exhaustion, not for 3 days and nights. And when she finally fell, others began to rise. By the week's end, dozens were shaking and spinning beside her. By the month's end, hundreds. No one could explain it. The priests said it was divine punishment. The physicians blamed hot blood. The people said the devil had come to dance. But behind the fear and madness lay something darker, a truth that would haunt Europe for centuries, that sometimes, in the face of unbearable suffering, the body itself becomes the voice of despair. The dancing plague had begun, and Strasbourg would never be the same again.
Chapter 1. The Woman Who Started to Dance. It began quietly. No thunder, no omen, just the sound of a single footfall striking cobblestone. Frau Trophia lived in a narrow timber house on one of Strasbourg's crooked lanes, a modest home filled with the smell of boiled grain and despair. The city, still part of the Holy Roman Empire, was a place torn between faith and famine. Bread riots had swept the region. The poor clawed at crumbs while the church walls gleamed with gold. Historians would later say she was possessed by frenzy, but perhaps she was simply broken. A widow, or a wife beaten by hunger and grief. A woman who had lost too much and had nowhere left to speak her sorrow. So she let her body do the talking. One hot July morning, as the bells rang from the Cathedral of Our Lady, she walked into the narrow street outside her door. The neighbors looked up from their buckets and stalls, and then she began to move. Her arms lifted slowly, like she was praying to the sky. Then her feet began to tap, softly at first, then faster, harder. Her hair loosened, her breath quickened. She spun, she shook, she stumbled, but did not stop. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then fell. Her husband begged her to come inside. She didn't hear him. By nightfall, a small crowd had gathered. No music played, yet her rhythm seemed alive, relentless, hypnotic. Some said her face was serene. Others swore she looked tormented. When darkness fell, torches lit the scene. People whispered prayers.
Some crossed themselves, others backed away. The next day, she was still dancing. Her bare feet bled on the stones. Her dress clung to her body with sweat. She swayed and twitched, a marionette cut loose from reason. By the third day, the murmurs had spread. Merchants from the market came to see. Mothers carried their children close. The local magistrate was informed. A woman in the streets, dancing without rest for days. The city authorities sent for the physicians, but in 1518, medicine was more mysticism than science. The doctors examined her pulse, her eyes, her tongue, and declared she was suffering from overheated blood. Their cure? Let her dance it out. So they cleared space in the street and left her to the mercy of her madness. And as the sun sank behind the cathedral, the people of Strasbourg went to sleep, not knowing that by morning others would join her. What began as a single woman's torment was about to become a city's nightmare. Chapter 2. When the streets began to shake. By the fourth day, the streets of Strasbourg no longer belonged to the living. They belonged to the dancers. It began slowly. A merchant carrying barrels of wine stopped to watch Frau Trophäa spin. Then a baker's apprentice stumbled out of his shop and began to mimic her movements, at first awkwardly, then with a growing rhythm he could not resist. Within hours others joined. Women from the market, children fleeing their mother's cries, laborers from the river docks. Their bodies trembled and jerked, convulsed and spun, as though possessed by a force unseen. The city itself seemed to shake with them. Windows rattled, doors clanged in their frames, bells tolled, not for worship, but as a warning. Something unnatural was unfolding. Physicians arrived in robes heavy with herbs and powders. They examined the dancers, poking at their arms and legs. "Hot blood," they muttered. "Too much humoral imbalance. We must purge the body. Let it sweat. Let it dance." So they encouraged it. They cleared the streets. They provided musicians. And the dancing grew. No one could stop it. By the end of the week, dozens were writhing on the cobblestones, their feet blistered, their mouths dry, their eyes glazed over. Some fell and were dragged to the side, only to rise again as if pulled by invisible strings. Reports tell of madness spreading through entire neighborhoods. Families pleaded for divine mercy. Priests screamed in the streets. The faithful prayed for salvation, but God seemed silent. The plague of movement had become contagious, not viral in the modern sense, but psychic, almost spectral. Fear itself seemed to spread through the city, and with fear came more dancing. By the second week, historians recorded that nearly 400 people were caught in the frenzy. Some died of exhaustion, some of strokes or heart failure. Some simply disappeared, swallowed by the fever of their own bodies. Strasbourg was no longer a city of commerce or worship. It was a city of motion, a living nightmare, a place where the body spoke in a language that reason could not understand. And still, no one knew why. Was it divine punishment? Demonic possession? A sickness of the mind or the blood? Or had human despair become so great, so unbearable, that the only escape was to move, to spin, to twist, to dance until the body itself surrendered? By the third week, the city leaders grew desperate. The mayor summoned the church summoned the prayers, the physicians summoned more dancers. But Strasbourg had already learned a terrifying truth. Once the plague began, it would not be stopped. Chapter 3. The Fever of Faith and Fear. As the plague of dance consumed Strasbourg, fear gripped the hearts of its people like a vice. Streets once filled with merchants and children now quivered under the relentless rhythm of bodies writhing in pain and ecstasy. The priests of Strasbourg saw a test from God. They preached from the pulpits, declaring that sin had angered the heavens. The city's citizens fell to their knees, praying for mercy, for forgiveness, for the end of the madness. Some confessions were whispered in the shadows. Others screamed aloud in terror as their neighbors convulsed nearby. The church tried to control the plague through ritual. Holy water was sprinkled on dancers. Candles were lit in every household. Processions wound through the streets with crosses raised high, and psalms were sung to drive out the demon. But it was useless. For with each chant, each prayer, each ritual, the dancers only moved faster, their bodies shaking violently, as if mocking the very prayers themselves. Children clung to their mothers. Mothers watched helplessly as fathers joined the throngs. One could hear the dull thump of aching feet striking stone, the gasps of bodies overstrained, the occasional cry of someone collapsing in exhaustion. Fear spread as swiftly as the dance itself. Whispers told of witches. Some said it was the devil walking invisibly among the streets, pulling people into madness. Others feared plague, famine, or an impending apocalypse. And in this fevered atmosphere, superstition was as infectious as the dancing. Even the physicians, experts in the humors and remedies of the time, grew uncertain. They argued among themselves, was it an imbalance of blood, a punishment from God, or had the city itself been cursed? One recommended isolation. Another suggested more dancing to sweat out the evil. The city's leaders, paralyzed by panic, decided to follow the latter. They cleared public halls and market squares, laid down boards for the dancers, and even brought in musicians to accompany them. Each note of the drum, each beat of the tambourine fanned the flames of the frenzy. And so Strasbourg became a paradox, a city attempting to heal itself through its own torment. The sick were encouraged to keep moving, their bodies thrashing, their muscles seizing, their bones screaming under the strain. Deaths were no longer exceptional. They became a silent rhythm alongside the dancing, a stifled cough, a sudden collapse, the stillness of someone finally surrendered to exhaustion. Records indicate dozens died from sheer fatigue, heart attacks, or strokes, yet still the dance continued. The people watched in horror, and some began to question the nature of reality itself. Was this human, divine, or something entirely else? Was the madness inside the dancers, or had it taken hold of the city as a whole? No one could answer. Only the streets knew the truth, and the streets would not stop shaking. Chapter 4. Doctors, Priests, and Panic. By mid-July, Strasbourg teetered on the edge of hysteria. The city's leaders had tried reasoning, prayer, and ritual, yet the plague of dance surged unchecked. The streets were filled with a haunting spectacle, dozens of people spinning, staggering, collapsing, and rising again, their bodies racked with exhaustion and pain. The physicians arrived in solemn procession, armed with remedies that seemed as desperate as the city itself. They carried powders, potions, and leeches, consulting texts written centuries before by men long dead. "It is the humors," one announced. "The blood is overheated. The body must purge itself through movement." And so the doctors decreed what they believed to be a cure: more dancing. Meanwhile, the priests preached fire and brimstone. From the pulpits they warned of God's wrath, of sinners condemned, of a city under divine judgment. They blessed the dancers, sprinkled holy water, and invoked saints' names. But in the squares, their voices were swallowed by the rhythmic thumping of hundreds of feet. Panic took root. Families hid indoors. Shops closed. Windows were shuttered against the sight and sound of the writhing crowd. The air was thick with sweat, blood, and fear. Some witnesses later described the screams of the dancers as a strange, otherworldly music, part agony, part ecstasy, part madness. The city council attempted to intervene. Officials called for isolation, hoping to separate the afflicted. But it was too late. The plague was no longer confined to a single woman or a single street. Entire neighborhoods shook. The dancers pulled others in, not physically, but through an invisible contagion of hysteria. Stories circulated of miraculous survivals and horrifying deaths. One man danced for 6 days straight, collapsing only to rise again. A young girl's feet were raw and bleeding, but she could not stop. Some fell dead in the street, others were carried away, yet their absence did not halt the frenzy. Doctors, priests, and officials all realized the city had become a theater beyond their control. The human body, they came to understand, was no longer just flesh and bone. It had become a vessel for collective terror and grief. And the city itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with the dancers' movements. Walls vibrated, cobblestones cracked. Even the river's waters appeared restless, as if reflecting the fevered energy of the streets. The people whispered. Some blamed witches. Others cursed the devil. The priests urged penance. The physicians argued for containment. And yet none could halt the madness. Strasbourg was gripped by a paradoxical horror. The more they tried to save themselves, the more the plague intensified. Every intervention seemed only to fan the flames. The city had become a theater of despair, where the body betrayed reason, and fear became the unrelenting music of survival.
Chapter 5. A City on its Knees. By August, Strasbourg had become unrecognizable. The once orderly streets, lined with timber houses and bustling markets, had been transformed into a theater of anguish. The city itself seemed to bow under the weight of its own madness. Every morning, neighbors would wake to the sound of pounding feet. They could not close their ears to it, could not shut their doors against it. The dancers filled the squares, the alleyways, even the steps of the cathedral. Bloodied feet left stains on cobblestones, raw flesh hung from toes and heels, yet still they danced. The plague no longer belonged to the poor, the widowed, or the sick. It had swept across every layer of society. Merchants, soldiers, apprentices, even priests caught in fleeting moments of weakness joined the endless movement. Fear and awe rippled through the city like a living entity. Families were torn apart. Children screamed as parents succumbed to the mania. Wives clung to husbands, convulsing in spasms. Neighbors buried the dead in haste, fearful that the plague might claim them next. Hospitals overflowed, though few dared to enter. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, relentless rhythm, the rhythm of bodies betraying themselves. Even the authorities, once pillars of order, could do nothing but watch. The mayor convened council meetings that ended in despair. The physicians' remedies failed. The priest's prayers fell silent against the unyielding momentum of the human body.
Strasbourg, proud and steadfast, had been humbled. The city's desperation gave birth to superstitions. Some whispered that the dancers were touched by the devil, cursed to move until death claimed them. Others said they were chosen by God, forced into a ritual of atonement. Rumors spread of convulsions so violent that the earth itself shook beneath their feet. In every household, the question lingered, who will dance next? The streets became a nightly vigil. Families lit candles and whispered prayers, watching through shuttered windows as shadows twisted and fell in grotesque rhythms. The sickened groans, the gasps, and the cries of pain became part of the city's heartbeat. Even birds and animals seemed to sense the terror, fleeing from the chaos. As the plague wore on, Strasbourg itself knelt, not in worship, not in prayer, but in submission. Humanity had been stripped of control. Rationality had fled. And in the fevered heat of summer, the city had no choice but to witness its own unraveling. Strasbourg was on its knees, and the dance had become its voice.